I'm going to read a little bit from the very beginning of the book. I'm going to read off my phone because I forgot my own book at home. And apparently the one here at the library has been checked out. So
I learned
apologies.
tonight who checked it out. She's sitting in the back of the room. But,
Thank you.
She's got the copy.
Yes, actually. Would you mind?
Jacqueline to the
course.
rescue.
But thank you so much. This is looks much better, among other things. Very briefly, read from the beginning of the book, and then we're going to chat. And I also send greetings from Huew Lemmey, who's the co-author of this book and the co-initiator of this project, and who this is the last of a series of events I'm doing without Huew because he just finished walking across all of northern Spain. He did the Camino from Barcelona to San Sebastian, or to Santiago rather. Anyway. Bad Gays, A Homosexual History. I also have to read the epigraph because it's from my favorite book. Homosexuals are widely considered to the same category of things as drugs, the category of illicit, dirty things that people have to be protected from. Since the homosexual is continually taught by the world around him that his natural home is the sewer, the homosexual is uniquely equipped to discover what truly belongs and doesn't belong in the sewer. From 3 Month Fever by Gary, Indiana. Introduction. In 1891, Oscar Wilde's star was on the rise. For a decade, he had been the talk of London, a literary wit who pioneered the fashion and philosophy of aestheticism. He had successfully published works of prose and collections of poetry, and was preparing his first novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, for publication, a masterful account of a Faustian bargain dripping with desire, vanity, and corruption. England regarded this sparkling Irishman with a combination of fascination, admiration, and horror, but no one could deny he was becoming a titan of the national culture. Yet, within 5 years, Wilde's reputation and his health were destroyed. Sentenced to 2 years of back-breaking hard labor, Wilde was spat at by strangers as he was transported via train to jail. Upon release, he fled into exile, living in penury under an assumed name. Nobody wanted to be known as his friend. Less than a decade after he had reached the heights of literary stardom, Wilde was dead. It's right and proper that we remember the role Wilde played within an otherwise staid and repressive Victorian culture, as well as the important work he did describing, in public, a form of same-sex desire that otherwise lay hidden and criminalized on the margins. Wilde was one of the first men in British society to give a creative form to a sexuality that barely yet understood itself, let alone was understood or discussed by straight people. For that, conservative forces succeeded in destroying him. But at the core of Wilde's story is his love for a terrible young man, a love that drove him close to madness and sparked the wildfire of events that led to his ruin. That boy, a petulant and cruel son of the British aristocracy, was Lord Alfred Douglas, known by his affectionate nickname, Bosey. Wilde and Bosey first met in 1891, when Bosey was a 21-year-old undergraduate at Wilde's alma mater, Magdalen College, Oxford. Bosey was an archetypal twink, popular and athletic, who cared more about his writing and activities in the new Uranian poetry movement, which idolized pederastic relationships between older and younger men, than his studies, which he never completed. In Wilde, he found his ideal older lover and benefactor, whose work and plays he had already praised in Uranian journals. Their tempestuous affair pushed Wilde's homosexuality from the realm of flirtatious literary innuendo into that of reckless public identity. Besotted with the young poet, Wilde fell in with Bosey's lifestyle and indulged his demands. The two lovers drank and partied together and became the subject of scurrilous rumors. They began to host wild sex parties with young working-class men who they paid to fuck or be fucked by. Wilde's public image, an educated and charming raconteur married with children, clashed with his private life, and while the conflict could hold for a few years, it wasn't long before the inevitable happened. Wilde was expecting it. In a letter to Bosey after his release from jail, he wrote, "It was like feasting with panthers. The danger was half the excitement. I used to feel as the snake charmer must feel when he lures the cobra. They were to me the brightest of gilded snakes. Their poison was part of their perfection." After clashing with Bosey's father, the Marquess of Queensberry, Wilde was left a calling card from the Marquess accusing him of being a sodomite. Queensberry, having 2 homosexual sons, who he regarded as having been corrupted by snob queers, was obsessed with homosexuality. Wilde's friends told him to leave the case alone, but pushed by an impetuous and jealous Bosey, who hated his father, Wilde sued. There was a fatal hole in Wilde's case. He was a sodomite, and Queensberry could prove it. The civil trial not only humiliated Wilde in the eyes of a homophobic Victorian public, but instigated a further criminal trial for gross indecency. Wilde was found guilty and sentenced to hard labor, which in the end indirectly killed him. Wilde's imprisonment, as awful and scandalous as it was, came at what was both a dangerous and unauspicious time for the new figure of the homosexual in Europe. Within certain literary and scientific circles, a new identity was forming. Sexologists described a third sex somewhere between male and female. In cities thronging with the new proletarian masses and enriched by colonial plunder, a group of people became the first generation of activists pursuing something we might recognize as gay rights. They discussed same-sex desire with sensitivity, even respect, calling themselves Uranians, Earnings, or even homosexuals. For such people, Wilde's trial was an important moment in the development of what would, in the ensuing decades, become something like a coherent movement. Scandals, after all, brought public attention. The newspapers wrote about the dangerous homosexuals, and more people began to recognize them as such, themselves as such, and be endangered and intrigued by what that recognition might mean. Wilde's utopian vision of love between men remains a creation myth of the public male homosexual identity. Speaking at his trial, Wilde launched a passionate defense of homosexual desire. It is in this century, he said, misunderstood, so much misunderstood that it may be described as the love that dare not speak its name, and on that account of it, I am placed where I am now. It is beautiful, it is fine, it is the noblest form of affection. There is nothing unnatural about it. Such a statement can almost be seen as a rallying cry for the century of LGBTQ rights activism that was to follow, and Wilde became one of its first martyrs. Bosey became a footnote in the story, an embodiment of evil twink energy, a poisoned apple whose path through life left a wake of destruction that led to the hero's downfall. Yet Bosey, the man, his desires, his attitudes, and his foibles, was just as integral to the eruption of homosexuality into the public sphere as was Wilde. Bosey set the trial in motion. Indeed, it was actually Bosey and not Wilde who had coined the term, the love that dare not speak its name, in one of his poems. No less than Wilde, Bosey shaped and was shaped by the attitudes and cultures of his time, and Bosey's later life of far-right political involvement is just as illuminating as his years with Oscar. After Wilde's death, Bosey married a poet named Olive Custance, and when their marriage went downhill, he converted to Catholicism and became espousing increasingly anti-Semitic views. He wrote articles accusing people of plots to undermine British masculinity with Jewish homosexuality, and in 1920 co-founded a magazine called Plain English that advertised copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, defamed leftist in the Irish, and accused Winston Churchill of being involved in a Jewish homosexual conspiracy to undermine the war effort. Churchill eventually sued and won. After a period of imprisonment, Bosey died poor and obscure in 1945. Only 2 people attended his funeral. For years, gay people have remembered Oscar as one of our own, but neglected Bosey as someone who has anything to tell us about how homosexuality came to be. Why do we choose to remember the witty and glamorous Wilde and to forget the Machiavellian, anti-Semitic, and louche Bosey? And more crucially, why do we assume that Wilde's life and attitudes shaped the track record of the project of homosexuality better than Bosey's? Bosey was hardly the first gay to become obsessed with far-right politics, or to confuse liberation with the freedom to live out his own desires and elevated class status. Bad Gays is a book about such characters, a book about the gay people in history who do not flatter us and who we cannot make into heroes, the liars, the powerful, the criminal, and the successful. From Alexander the Great to J. Edgar Hoover, our history is littered with them. Unlike our heroes, however, our Oscar Wildes, our Audre Lordes, our Alan Turings, we rarely remember them as gay. And yet their sexuality was just as important an influence on their lives as those whom we celebrate, and their stories have much to tell us about how the sexual identities we understand came to exist. Over the course of this book, we will profile these evil and complicated queers from our history. Among their ranks are emperors and criminals, fascist thugs and famous artists, austere Puritans and detached bon viveurs, yet all of them have one thing in common. They engaged in behavior that in the context of today's society, we might understand as somehow gay. By examining the interplay of their lives and their sexualities, this book investigates the failure of homosexuality as an identity and a political project.
we have a big round of applause?
And it goes on,
please?
but for however many 100 pages. Thank you for the book. I'll get it back.
And you'll have to buy it to read the rest.
Grill me first.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for that reading. That was wonderful, and that puts me in the perfect position to ask my first question. You mentioned that, well, you state quite clearly that homosexuality has failed. And in fact, in the conclusion of this book, you also write, the history of homosexuality is a long history of failure, of failed attempts at understanding ourselves, between ourselves and in society, full of racism and exclusion. In what ways has homosexuality and homosexuality today failed?
Thank you for that question.
Let's
So
get into it.
the first, you start me off with an easy one. So the first thing that I want to say, if it's not obvious enough by the way that I'm dressed and everything about me, is that I'm a homosexual, and so is Huew. And both Huew and I are extremely aware of the fact that we exist on top of the history that we are writing and deconstructing, right? So and there are many ways in which the homosexuality as a civil rights project has actually been remarkably, startlingly successful. A certain degree of civil rights consensus, although we're watching that consensus get a little unconsensusy at the moment, has been won in a very short amount of time. And that is where the dominant narratives of this movement come from, especially the dominant narratives of this movement that are not being written for a specialist academic, activist audience, academic or activist audience, I should say. So the best-selling gay history book of recent years is by the reporter at the New York Times who did a lot of the kind of movement-level reporting. It was written after the Obergefell decision in the US, and the title of the book is Victory, the story of the successful LGBT rights movement. So in trying to write something that was more critical, in trying to think about what has happened since that moment of 2017, when even if you wanted to ignore all of the people that this had left behind, you could be very triumphant about what had been achieved, which now I think we would be a little more careful about that, even just looking at how fragile it seems to be, right? We wanted to start this with a big provocative statement like homosexuality is a failed identity and political project. And then we spend the rest of the time talking about what we mean. And just like the title, Bad Gays, another kind of provocative statement that we spend the rest of the time explaining it, it ends up being slightly more complicated as it goes along. What we mean by that is that it is a political project that has failed to articulate its place in a politics of everybody, because we all know that we don't live in, we still live in the world before, can I use the word revolution in here? We live in the world, we live in the world before the big change, right? We live in the world, we live in the imperfect world. We live in the world that requires transformation, right? We live in the world on the highway to climate catastrophe. We live in a world of rising far-right political movements. We live in a world of police violence. Look at the city of Paris today, right? And so what in the past 150 years or so since the word homosexuality is coined, it has consistently been a political project of people who are trying to find a place for themselves within this kind of broader transformative politics, and it has consistently failed to articulate something that actually places it there and places it in meaningful solidarity, at least across the board, not always. And that's what we mean. And then we also think, I think I can speak for Huew in this one, I think we both also think that one of the reasons why some of these civil rights consensuses are seeming more fragile than people maybe initially thought, is precisely because of some of that history. But anyway.
And we'll get to that as well and talk about the
Good.
fragility of homosexuality in our current day and age. I'm interested in this distinction you're making between, this distinction I think you just made between political projects and identity projects, and the way that homosexuality as a term that was coined in the 19th century is characterized primarily as a political project, because there's also an entire history to homosexuality which precedes the term homosexual. And I want us to focus on language here because I think this book, insofar as it is a book about variously evil people across history who engaged in same-sex relationships, it's also a book about the different ways that we have been capable of conceiving of homosexuality, of gayness, the different language we've used to describe it, the different ways it's been performed, legislated. And we realize as we read this book that this term homosexual is a very historically contingent term, which is dependent upon a lot of different historical factors which shaped it, and which is not necessarily stable, which is still subject to change in the current day and age. So I want to talk, first of all, I want to ask you about this term gay, which is in the title, when this term came into use, what it actually means, and how comfortable you feel applying it to all of the characters, bad boys across this book, because for a lot of them that term didn't even exist.
Sure. So there is a same-sex behavior and gender trouble of various kinds are transhistorical and transcultural.
Can you explain what that means a little bit more?
I'm about to. That means that basically you're throughout every record of every human society, you find versions of same-sex behavior, both sexual and romantic and sort of loving, and you also find people who are living outside of or across from or in tension with whatever the gender system is of the place and moment. What is not transhistorical is the way that those things actually look socially. So to give one example, the first person in our book is Hadrian. And we use the term bad and gay both as expansively as possible, but then we explain what we're doing at each individual moment so that we can try to have it both ways, to both encourage this kind of identification across time, because that's what I think a way that all of us actually do relate to history, but then also to think about what we actually mean in each different time and place, right? So Hadrian is someone who is someone who's consistently spoken about by people who definitely are gay in the way that we mean it, right, the way that I am, which means, two adult men or more sometimes, but two adult men together in a relationship, right? For Hadrian, who is definitely someone who has a profound like romantic and sexual relationship with Antinous and other men, but most famously Antinous. What homosexuality was, or same-sex behavior was, that you had a wife and children, but then you also on the side only topped younger men, right? Which I don't know how to make this joke in France. When I'm in England, I say, nowadays we don't call that being gay, we call it being a Tory, and people laugh. But anyway, but the point being, right, that this is not recognizably, this is someone who is clearly a figure of identification for so many people. But if you actually look at what if you actually look at what he's doing, it's not recognizable to my life, right? It's not recognizable to the lives of most gay men, or most gay men that are here or that and so you start to see from a story like that just how contingent these things can be, and just how different these things look in different times and places. The word gay itself starts being used by activists in mostly in the US in the 1950s in Southern California, who are looking for a word that isn't describing a mental illness. And so for a while they come up with homophile. Homophile gets used into the 60s, but then some of them already are liking the word gay more, are finding it a little bit more expansive, and then gay really takes over in the kind of post-68, post-Stonewall moment, of gay power joining Black power and joining women's power and joining other kinds of that kind of new left articulations. and that's when it really takes over. And basically after the mid-70s, early mid-70s, especially in the English language context, nothing is called the homophile organization anymore. They're just using the word gay. The other interesting thing is that when gay starts, it starts big. It starts in this sort of expansive way, and then gay ends up shrinking as people find words to describe themselves, and also as some gays start not wanting to be identified the same way as other people. So there's a moment in Martin Duberman's book about Stonewall, which is really good, where they're like Sylvia Rivera at the time of Stonewall is identifying as gay. That doesn't make her any less of a trans woman, right? There are some people who then try to use that and launch off on a whole kind of history denying transphobic screed. But it just goes to show that at that point, gay included people who were, they would say gay, or they would say living full-time, like full-time drag queen or something like that. And it was just like terms change as people, and it was both trans people finding words for themselves and also gay men who wanted to say, no, we're not like them. We're not these people living on the streets. We're not these people, who went too far, as those gay men would say. Like these terms are always being contested, and there's always kind of,
Yeah, and you talk about this in the book too. You mentioned Foucault's history of sexuality and this idea of the difference between approaching sexuality as an activity. So in the case of the Greeks, and what Hadrian was emulating, that is the activity of an older man having sex with a younger man in a particular situation, whereas homosexuality now has taken on the status of an identity. It's a category with which people identify, which describes them in terms of who they are in some way, as opposed to what they do. And you write about Hadrian specifically that the designation of gender as the most important distinguishing figure of sexual identity is not historically universal, and the meaning of gender is not fixed throughout history. Hadrian's story tells us of the important status, power, education, and sexual role has had in the story of same-sex desire.
Yeah, there's another fascinating one, not in the book, but someone we just did a podcast episode about, was the 17th century Japanese shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu, and learning about that sex gender system was fascinating. So there was a kind of older younger male thing that's common in a lot of kind of feudal societies, but the older and younger men was actually a gender difference. It was conceptualized as a gender difference. And it had to do with not with age, but with there was a specific kind of rite of passage, and certain things happened. You got a different haircut and you dressed differently and you became a man. So there were older younger relationships where the boy was older than the man. But it had to be across that distinction of before or after this shift. And it would have been unacceptable if it was two people afterwards. So there were some people who would write poems about how their taste was for like bearded, balding, hairy boys, because it wasn't actually, it was a gendering of age that then, which is just another thing where it sounds like it's from another planet, but it's just that sex looks different to different people at different times, and it has a lot to do with systems of production and how people think about that. And yeah.
And we're going to get to the systems of production too, but I want to talk a little bit more about, we've mentioned Hadrian, and you've been talking about how as gay as a term isn't stable, homosexuality isn't stable. These are categories that are constantly in flux. And over time, what we see is people seeking for terms to describe themselves. But what we also see across this book and across history is people seeking historical examples of what they are. So people to whom they can turn and say, this person did this before me, therefore I am natural, therefore I am normal, therefore I am, insert XYZ phrase there. We see this today in this kind of obsession within certain corners of the gay community with representation. But we also see it with someone like Hadrian, who was turning to the Greeks as an example of what homosexuality used to be historically. And then we also see it with this sort of colonial trend of looking at indigenous populations and seeking in them some sort of primitive homosexual urge that precedes the repressive functions of Western civilization, et cetera. And you unpack that sort of colonial myth as well. But what is this function of myth representation within the construction of homosexual identity across history?
That's a really good question. I'm writing a whole PhD about that. it's this kind of process of self-historicization is not what Caroline Dinshaw calls the queer desire for history, a lovely phrase, it is a feature of all of these different gay and queer movements, but not only, right? And I think the mythic aspect of it, I don't know, it's I'm going to do some completely wild off the cuff speculating, so strap in. But part of me wonders if you are part of a minoritized community where you are born into it and your parents are also in it, right? If you're Jewish, right? If you're a minority ethnic group and wherever it is that you live, you have some sense of what that means, some sense of the story, some sense of the origin. I mean, Judaism is all about constantly narrating the story of who we are and this is where we come from, and it was this and it was that, and then this happened and 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 this happened, and they tried to kill us and they didn't, let's eat, and now we're here. And if you're gay, you have to find that for yourself. Most gay and lesbian people have not historically been born into like families of gays and lesbians, right? And so it's been a lot of people finding that for the fun on their own and sort of making that for themselves. And so people, I think, have constantly been looking for examples and looking to not be alone, looking to not be the only one in a time when you were taught that you were sick and you were the only one. And so I think that's where the impulse comes from for this kind of, and is an incredibly common organizing strategy and tactic and thing that is said really across the whole Western world. Wherever you look, there's always that one pamphlet where someone says, well, it wasn't just us, it was Michelangelo and it was Frederick the Great and it was this and it was this and it, and these people where you go into the historical record and there actually is some kind of documentary evidence, and especially people who are kind of considered to be extremely important foundational figures in cultural or political or social history. And so we're not like, I'm not a sick pervert, I'm Leonardo da Vinci, right? And I think the power of that is obvious. And I think the same thing goes for the kind of anthropological and ethnographic stuff, right? No, I'm not sick, I'm not mentally ill, because if you look, and this actually, it's a true observation, although it's an observation gleaned through incredibly violent and unjust power relations and often made in the context of a lot of non-true and very racist observations, but it is true that there is same-sex activity and gender nonconforming activity everywhere. And so when you start looking at people who are really different from you and you start seeing it there, and amongst all of them, the observation that this exists, I think, is real. Then because this observation is being made by people of their time and of their place, the observation is then phrased as these people who are the nature people, right, who are living as we once did when we lived in huts, they show that our prohibitions against sexuality are the thing that is artificial and evolved, right? And we can kind of go back to nature, and there's this great Foucault quote, "Tomorrow sex will be good again." One of my favorite chapters in the book is actually about this. There's an anthropologist by the name of Margaret Mead, who was of the second generation of anthropologists who understood themselves to be doing anti-racist work. So her PhD teacher was a man named Franz Boas, who was trained in a school of anthropology in which the world was explicitly seen as a conveyor belt to civilization. You started with the nature people, who were sub-Saharan Africa and indigenous people, and they were people who had no culture, they had no history, nothing about them had ever changed. They were considered to be the people in German, they would say, the original people. And this is how Europe had once been like this too, but Europe had gotten on the conveyor belt of civilization. And then there were the culture people, which is basically people who weren't white, but they got there and saw big buildings, and so they had to come up with something, right? Like you can't look at the Taj Mahal and say these people have no culture. So they would call them the culture people. And this was the kind of imperial China. This was the empires of India. This was the Arabian, the Iranian and Persian empires, the Aztec, etc. And then there was civilization, which was white people. And Boas was one of the first people who started to deconstruct that. And he said, instead of doing this, he wanted to look at cultures. He said these nature people do have a culture, and I want to go understand it on its own terms. He failed to do that, and there are many critiques of the project you don't want to get into, but anyway, he then trained a whole generation of people, and a lot of the people that he trained were themselves early kind of queer people. This is in the 1920s, sort of bohemian queers like Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, who were, he also trained Zora Neale Hurston, by the way, but then she left. And the way she was treated by her white PhD colleagues was very not good. But anyway, back to the story. Young queer people who saw in this anthropology of looking for cultural differences a way to kind of understand and explain themselves. So Margaret Mead is a bisexual woman. She goes for her PhD dissertation to Samoa. She says, I'm going to Samoa because I want to understand their culture of youth sexuality on its own terms. And because it's Samoa and they're a very simple people, I can understand everything about their culture in 7 weeks. Not making that up. And she comes back and she writes a book called Coming of Age in Samoa, which is, unlike most anthropology PhDs, a bestseller. And the book becomes hugely influential because she comes back and reports essentially that Samoa is a tropical paradise where there is no such thing as adolescent neurosis, where everyone is having sex with everybody, free love reigns, it's so wonderful. Can't we learn so much about our troubled Western youth, our troubled teenagers from the wonderful people of Samoa? In fact, my analysis would be that Mead is kind of looking for herself and looking for an explanation of her own sort of living free love that she's living in Greenwich Village in the 1920s and trying to figure out what that means and how she can do that and whatever. Her book then becomes evidence for a whole generation of gay rights activists. Esther Newton, one of the first openly lesbian anthropologists, writes a memoir called Margaret Mead Made Me Gay. And it's funny, but it's not a joke, right? Because they then see, well, look, science, not many of them not even knowing that Mead was bisexual because it wasn't public. Well, science has proven, and look, see, here it is. It's natural, right? So it's like people going and looking for themselves in this like doubled, tripled, quadrupled level of projection fantasy. It's a very long-winded answer, but I hope it was a good story.
But it's interesting because it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, it's a beautiful notion. I forget how you described it, the queer person's desire for history, this idea of seeing oneself in the past, being able to identify oneself with a community. It's beautiful and it's necessary, but I also think that, you know, over-reliance upon origin myths is also the birth of fascism, that what you see today with this over-reliance upon representation leads to the need for books like Bad Gays because we're kind of compulsively ignoring all the flaws of these historical characters.
Yeah, that's true for the kind of historical characters who are like us, right? And for the big O others, right? There's a second and more important problem, which is that if you are basing your whole concept of who you are as a white queer person in Europe on first a racial analogy, right? An analogy between sexuality and racial minority status, and secondly on a bunch of anthropology that is often really inaccurately and in extremely racist ways describing people and also reproducing these systems of power in that very representative project, right? Who is available to be used as an analogy by whom, right? Then you're actually writing a lot of these problems into the fabric of what it means to be gay or queer or lesbian or whatever. And a lot of the problems the movement has historically had around race, I think actually are, and I'm working on a project about this, the historian Laurie Marhofer just wrote a book about Magnus Hirschfeld, the German sexologist and activist in race. And we agree that a lot of these problems have at least some of their origins in some of these ways that some of these like systems of some of these ideas and concepts that got written into the kind of meaning of what these identities were as they're being created, because they are products of a time.
And you address this too. I mean, the main thesis of the book is essentially that homosexuality, my reading of it, homosexuality as a term classification is a byproduct of, the happy fortuitous combination of capitalism, colonialism, and the modern day nation state. Which isn't a great history for us.
Tastes great together.
Yeah, but that's a hard sell for Pride Month. You know, you don't put that in a Bank of America float and drive it through the West Village or whatever. I mean, can you describe more how homosexuality emerged out of this historical matrix? We can look, for example, at the example of Frederick the Great in 19th century Prussia, where you talk about how urbanism, how increased disposable income, and how the consolidation of power of the state led to homosexuality as a character and as a practice kind of becoming possible in a certain way.
Sure, yeah. So the short version of this is that as cities start to fill up, and as people start to come off the land and to come live in cities, that is the process by which sexuality as we understand it comes to be. Obviously, sexuality exists before, I mean, sex exists before this, right? Like that people reproduced themselves to the point where this happened, right? But if when you get people when people start living in cities, when people are off the land, when people are out of living in extended family and kinship units, what you get is you get large groups of people of the same age living together at the same time in close quarters. And when they start doing that, then they start fucking, to put it bluntly, and you start to get a whole system, a whole series of kind of discourses and panics about regulating all of this and about what this is and about what is happening and about what this means. There's also extremely concrete needs for the labor force to reproduce itself, right? The kind of peasant labor reproduces itself without too much trouble, but factory labor forces need to keep increasing, and so and people are living together, and they're not you're not having as many kids as you can feed, right? Things are your people are living financialized lives for the first time. They're using money to buy goods and services as opposed to living in barter economies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And I could
and so this happens it starts in 14th century Florence is one of the first places that we have a lot of records of this happening, which is also one of the first places where sodomy was ever actually policed, was in the Florence of the Medici. But it's as this happens that both heterosexuality and homosexuality, as we understand them, come to exist. The term heterosexuality is coined afterwards, first as a term to describe sex addiction, and then it gets turned into a term to describe whatever homosexuality isn't. So it's always defined as this kind of negative opposition. But all kinds of even heterosexual dating culture emerges also in the kind of late 19th and early 20th century, right? This is when people are suddenly, even heterosexual mating is occurring in this thing that we just assume now is what happens, right? Where young people who haven't necessarily known each other from birth go through a period where they date a series of different people, and then the eventual marriage kind of comes from this dating, right? And all of this is also being kind of worked out. It's a great book about this by Jonathan Nedkatz called The Invention of Heterosexuality. Highly recommend.
And I would, excuse me, I would love to talk more about that. But I've just looked at the clock and realized that it's already almost time for audience questions, and we've gotten through half of the questions I had planned for you.
Okay.
As it tends to go. So I want to just speed straight ahead up to the present. We've established that homosexuality, here we go. We've established that homosexuality has a bit of a sketchy history. It's come out of capitalism, colonialism. It might be reliant upon some fantasy of the racial other. It might not be. There's a lot to do with sex work as well, which we unfortunately didn't get to. But if you read this lovely book, you will learn all about that. I want to talk about what its future is, basically. So now that we've established this slightly unhappy, slightly gay, slightly bad, slightly evil history of homosexuality, what do we do with it today? How do we move forward with this identity that, I mean, you've established yourself as a homosexual. If the audience can tell by my short hair, I'm a homosexual. How do we proudly call ourselves homosexuals, knowing the historical burden of that term?
I mean, it's just to be clear, I don't think is this true? I don't think it's any worse than anything else. I mean, I don't think it's a uniquely horrible. I mean, it's not a kind of anti-homosexual book, right? It's a book that is about how this is as much a product of all of the things that we don't like as everything else. As is the historian's want, what we've done is given many richly footnoted pages of everything that went wrong, and then at the end we have this extremely la-di-da little thing about what we might do instead. But I think the book has two conclusions. And I think if I explain the two conclusions, that might be a good place to end. The first conclusion is the last chapter of the book, which is about Pim Fortuyn, who was a Dutch political figure. He was one of the pioneers of the resurgence of the new right in Europe. He was assassinated in 2002 in the course of an election campaign, which he was on track to win. And he was not only gay, he was someone who made his homosexuality an incredibly public and explicit part of his political identity. He went on television during the election and talked about going into dark rooms and how semen tasted during the campaign. This is not someone who's there and there's like, this is not Mayor Pete with the dog and the husband, whatever. This is like really, you know, someone who's extremely explicitly making his sexuality a big part of the play. And it was brilliant. I mean, it's evil, but it was brilliant because this was a way of communicating to liberal Dutch people who didn't want to think of themselves as the bad guys, that because he would flip it immediately and say, so don't you want to live in a country where I can come on television and talk about that and still be in politics? Because if you do, you've got to stop these Moroccans from coming in because they're going to change that. And so it turns the anti-immigrant stuff and it turns the racism into a defense of liberal values through this incredibly highly performed homosexuality. And I think that is one of the directions that gay identities, at least in Europe, are going to go. I mean, in this country, the plurality of the gay vote was won by Marine Le Pen in the last election, in the primary, the last two elections. That's true. Not the majority. It's not, and not disproportionately much or less, but certainly similar voting patterns you start to see. That essentially people start voting not like a queer bloc, but they start voting their race and class and other things. Even more so in some parts of France, actually. The other direction is the very kind of flowy and vague conclusion of the book, where we talk about a bunch of different places where different kinds of solidarity have actually happened. I'll tell the story of one of these moments to conclude because it's great. There was a trade union on the merchant marine fleet in off the shore of California in the 30s called the Marine Cooks and Stewards. These were people who were working in the ships, working as cooks and stewards. And the union was communist, it was anti-racist, and it was pro-gay. So they had signs saying no red baiting, no queen baiting, no race baiting. Don't let the boss don't do your boss's work for them, essentially. And there was a story about someone who called Frank Bowers, who was a cook on one of these ships, a Nelly, and Frank Bowers got a giant metal soup ladle and beat the guy up, and he never said anything bad about him again.
Let's have a round of applause for that.
So there we go.
Ben, thank you so much for this conversation. This is lovely.
Thank you so much for the wonderful questions.
I would love to ask you even more, but we have an audience here that I'm sure is begging to ask questions as well. Alfonso has a microphone in his hand or next to him, which he will bring to you if you are brave enough to raise your hand. So, questions, yes.
Hello. Yes, we got one.
It's a little bit of a commentary. I don't want to be one of those people who just makes a comment and doesn't ask a question. But you talked about something that really resonated with me, which is this kind of Jewish identity within the family, where you're prescribing to what your parents have lived and your grandparents, and this kind of marginalized identity, if you want to put it that way, where gay people grow up in a family typically that is not necessarily of gay parents. We were just talking about this yesterday. I don't even know how to describe it, but I came to gay life at the age of 54 for the first time. I was in a relationship. I'd been in a very straight world and straight life, happily so. But I grew up Jewish, and I kind of feel I had my first experience about 6 weeks ago where somebody said, basically faggot. It was basically something like that. We were walking together and I said, damn, I thought I was just going to get away. Like, it's so easy now to be gay or to do what you want. And it kind of brought me back immediately to the kind of anti-Semitism, which I didn't really care so much about when I was a kid because I was very happy about being who I was. But it brought me back to that. And I wonder, maybe you have some advice for somebody like me who's kind of new to the game and is in a certain way very naive. I'm not looking for historical references. I'm not necessarily looking for a community because I feel like it's so easy to be gay now, maybe doing it, coming at it as an adult, coming at it with a lot of experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting how easy it is to be gay now. I think really depends on where you are and who you are. I was reminded of this. I was kind of mouthing off on our publisher Verso has a podcast. I was mouthing off on the Verso podcast and sort of having one of these idle speculations, bebop speaking, and said that I wasn't sure. And there was a lot more context to this, but the of course the thing that they then pull for the little promo was me saying that I wasn't sure if gay men were queer anymore, which is a fun little thing to say, but whatever. What does it actually mean? And I got a very impassioned note. So one of the best things about this project is hearing from people, and we have been both, I think, really moved by both positive and not positive when people write something long and critical and in good faith and it's intensive and they want to talk, we'll talk with them, and we've learned a lot from those people. We've changed the show and the project because of the conversations. I mean, it really is a big part of what we do. And he said, I'm a teacher in Dallas, Texas. So is my husband. Neither one of us are allowed to be out at work. That has changed in the past year. It's gone from we can no longer tell our students about each other. That would be a fireable offense. We could be sued by the parents or charged by the parents with sexualizing their children. We could be and so I think it really depends on who you are, like who you are and where you are. And advice, I don't know. I think something that is one of the reasons I think why the audience for the show and for the book has been mostly very, very young, mostly under 25, which I was not necessarily expecting, which the publisher wasn't necessarily expecting. And the cliche that existed was that young queer people weren't interested in queer history, and I found that to be actually the opposite to be the case. That people, I think, are actually really hungry, especially in a world where I think whatever age you are now, depending on where you are, there is less, because of gentrification, less kind of physical queer life, and you're less likely to have those first experiences of being in queer life, being at a bar where you're going to be talking to people of a variety of ages, or being at a community center, or being someplace real. It's more likely to be virtual. If it is in real life, it's more likely to be kind of affinity based, or people maybe from a similar kind of network or situation, right? That I think there's a huge amount of hunger actually right now for exactly these kinds of histories. I think people are really looking for history and the more information about who we are and how we got here and what's happening. So yeah, hope that was an answer. But
Other questions in the room? Wait for the microphone.
Thank you. First and foremost, congratulations for the podcast. It's really nice.
thank you so much.
Really like it. Among the 80 episodes that now available, I think that the one about Rycon, I felt that reaction that when you guys were discussing, it was really got you to the guts.
Yeah.
But besides that, Rycon, J. Edgar Hoover, and for me especially Andrew Sullivan, because I think that yes, because I think that we see more and more gays thinking and acting like Andrew Sullivan. Is there any other bad gays portrayed on the podcast that you feel like, God, I can do it?
I mean, I can't with any of these people in that sense, right? Andrew Sullivan wrote us an email, by the way, 3 days after the show came out, back when very few people listened to us. So someone was Googling herself. allegedly. But anyway, the um, the yeah. I think the episodes, I think you put your finger right on it. I think the episodes that are the least fun for us to do and that are the most challenging are the ones that are people who are close enough to our time, right? And people who really seem to be precursors to this this kind of far right backlash and to this kind of gays joining the right thing. And one of the things that's fun about doing the show is that we get to live in such different universes every week, right? So you go from a Nazi to someone like Joe Carstairs, who is an eccentric British oil, sort of non-binary British oil heir who raced speedboats before retiring to rule over a private island in the Bahamas with their life partner, who was a 1 foot tall leather doll named Lord Todd Wadley. I am not making any of that up. At one point, they were dating Marlene Dietrich briefly, and this was when Lord Todd Wadley was around. So I guess your trivia fact for tonight is that at one point, Marlene Dietrich was in a throuple with a doll. But that kind of an episode, right, is obviously on a completely different emotional universe and implicates us and makes us, it's all, and so that's one of the joys of doing the show. The book is more coherently about these real serious issues, which is not to say that it isn't fun. There's a lot of dick jokes, but it's also more telling this kind of coherent story and therefore a little bit more I can't throughout. Pim Fortown is another one. That last chapter, that he's really someone where it just terrifies me how much of that I hear. And I remember being a few weeks ago at a gay bar that I go to regularly in my neighborhood where I live, and talking to the bartender, who's like a much older guy, who said, yeah, God, this neighborhood is just, it's really, it doesn't feel like our neighborhood anymore. And I said, oh yeah, of course, expecting this to be about gentrification. And he said, yeah, it's just like Romania brought a dump truck and put all of its problems on my doorstep. And you're like, hey, what do I, like, I did say something, right? But like, but you do, this is something that you do kind of see and hear and encounter, and yeah, I guess historicizing it gives you the tools to start understanding it or something. But I guess that's what historians like to tell you, so I'll tell you that.
We have time for one last question.
Do we have a question from? Oh no, wait a minute. A question here. Great.
So I just had a question more about the historical situation. So a lot of these figures are from much more ancient time periods.
Yep.
Where homosexuality was maybe less lived as a equal couple or relationship, and more some kind of like dominance-based situation. And I was just wondering how you reconcile that, or how we conceptualize homosexuality today, where it's definitely more about relationship between equals.
Yeah, so the people in the book who are from before that shift to identities and sexuality that I talked about, we talk about them in this book and under this label gay to the extent that that's a history from the present, because these are people who were important for people who then come later, right? So someone like Hadrian, we're constantly describing the differences between what he does and later people, but we're putting him in the book because Hadrian is someone who then keeps coming back as a model for later people who definitely are, right? And the same goes for Frederick the Great, who's like slightly before, although Frederick the Great's interesting. He's sort of the Prussian emperor of the 1700s. He challenges the historian's desire to say that there's no such thing as coherent homosexuality before 1865, because he says things like, alas, fortune is a woman, and I am not that way inclined. And lives in, as soon as he becomes emperor of Prussia, he banishes his wife to a palace 40 kilometers away and builds a giant pink palace on top of a hill of terraced vineyards, where he plays the flute and writes flute concertos and lives with his Italian greyhounds with whom he was buried. And
It's a good life.
and so someone like that is interesting because on the one hand, you look at everything about this person's life, or you go to Sanssouci, which is outside Berlin, the palace, and you think, oh my God, this faggot. And then part of what you're seeing is someone whose aesthetic then gets adopted, right? and in two very different ways, right? The Italian greyhounds and flute playing stuff goes in one direction, right? And then Frederick the Great also becomes this really interesting figure for these Weimar era right-wing macho gays who say we're not homosexuals because homosexuals are gender deviants and the Jews and it's a conspiracy. We're pure men who are such men that we won't even have sex with women because that's how much we're men. And look, we were like Frederick the Great who conquered half of Europe, so we're manly. So that's right. So that's how we kind of we bring the people into the present day by thinking about their meaning over time and how their historical reception over time can also be historicized and can also teach us something about where we're at now.